Yes, hello once again. Welcome back to Classic Dirt Bike TV, where of course we do our very best to try and bring you more of those old school vintage dirt bikes from way back in the day. Now we're going to continue with our current series of looking at classic and rare 125 motocross dirt bikes, and in this next featured video we've got another 3 examples for you to take a look at. So let's dive straight into that video now and have a look at our first machine. Yes, welcome back once more to our new series of looking at air and liquid cooled 125cc dirt bike classics. And first up, it's a very nice 1985 liquid cooled 125 KX Kawasaki from Ewan Davidson, which, as I understand, has just undergone some kind of refurbishment just recently, but nevertheless a very good example of one of these iconic green mini Kawasaki's. Now for 1985, these smaller KX125s were pretty awesome little bikes that had a relatively light tubular steel chassis that was both strong and light enough to chuck around the racetrack. And as I remember, I think this bike only weighed about 214 pounds, and that was including, of course, all its oils and cooling and a full gas tank as well. But certainly for that year, it's widely accepted that these KX125s were one of the best smaller bikes available in that year, because the entire package of chassis, suspension, motor and the bike's overall handling made these bikes a rider's favourite in that year. Now the KX's motor was just a single cylinder 2-stroke liquid cooled 6-speed power plant that had a bore of 56 millimeters, and I think it was a stroke of about 50.6 millimeters, and it also had Kawasaki's KIPS power valve, or Kawasaki integrated power valve system, if you want to give it its full title. But it was basically a valve that opened and closed to even out and broaden the engine's power band at various motor RPMs. But apparently it all worked quite well when the bike was ridden on the track. And once again, the 1985 KX125s were renowned for their light clutches, which was pretty much the same on many of the other 125s of their day, but it was still cable operated even for that year. Now most of the cooling of the engine was assisted by this gear-driven water pump here on the right-hand side of the motor, and the rest of the cooling was done by having a radiator fitted onto either side of the frame that could be filled through this filler pressure cap here on the left-hand side of the bike. But in terms of one of these smaller KX power plants, this 1985 liquid cool motor was certainly a peach of an engine that was both powerful and very reliable, and in its way it was all that you could really ask from such a small 2-stroke 125 motocross engine. Now up at the front end of our 85 KX125, it was a pair of Kayaba front forks, which normally would have been 43mm stanchions in that year, which again did perform reasonably well, though they were said to be a bit on the soft side, which is what you'd expect on one of these smaller 125 motocrossers. Now once more, at the back end of our KX125 in that year, it was a Kayaba single monoshock here at the rear that could be adjusted for height, rebound and damping, and it was connected onto the frame at the top and swing arm here at the bottom by way of this linkage connection here at the front of the swing arm. But again, this was an excellent suspension setup for this KX125. Now also onto the outside of the chassis, and on this right hand side we had the gas and oil storage tank for that rear shock, where of course it could be cooled by the ambient air passing along the side of the bike, and it also had some means of adjustment to the rebound and damping by way of these two little clicker adjusters on the outside, so that you could dial in your own personal rear suspension settings. But just like many of the other dirt bikes of its day, Kawasaki also had a relatively modern style single pot hydraulic disc brake here at the front, which despite it being a single piston unit, it still did very well in slowing up or stopping our 125, although surprisingly Kawasaki decided to stay with the old school drum brake here on the rear rather than opting for another hydraulic disc system. But nevertheless, this again was a very good rear anchor for our KX, not as snatchy and powerful as a disc brake, but very progressive with good stopping power, which is another reason that riders still prefer these old drum systems on the back of their motocrossers. And also at the back of our 85 KX, it was Kawasaki's excellent Unitrack rear swing arm, which for its day was said to be among some of the best in the business for that year, but its construction was just a simple box section type of design, but when it was connected to that Kayaba rear shock and linkage system and all set up and adjusted correctly, then it was without doubt more than a match for similar 125s in its class. Now, as you've no doubt guessed, Ewan's Kawasaki isn't exactly 100% stock standard, because it does have a couple of non-original parts bolted onto it, including this replacement D and G expansion chamber and tailpipe, which is not that surprising when you consider that this little bike's now clocking on to almost 38 years old now, so you have to expect that at least one or two parts will have been swapped during its lifetime. Although it's certainly a very nice example of one of these iconic KX125s from 1985, a bike that was hugely popular with youth and adult riders alike from that period, because this bike did have it all: a very good chassis, good handling and excellent suspension for a smaller 125. But the best part of the 85 KX Kawasaki was that liquid-cooled two-stroke motor, which, as long as you kept it in its sweet spot, which is around the mid-range, then there wouldn't be many other 125s that would pass you on the racetrack. Okay, so next up we take another delve into the Terry Pickering classic bike collection, and this time it's another rare Italian classic, a 1970s Moto Gori 125 twin shock racer. Now, this featured bike here was never actually a bike at all in the true sense of the word, because this machine started its life as just boxes of old Moto Gori spare parts that were all refurbished and then rebuilt by Terry's good friend and ex-Kramer works rider Keith Ree. who in fact not only rode those works machines for the Kramer factory, he was also a team rider for Michael back in the day. But Moto Gori were yet another one of the small Italian motorcycle manufacturers that were formed in the mid-1960s by Giancarlo Gori, who at that time were also associated with another company called Moto Brim, and so their first bikes that they marketed were called Gori Brim motorcycles. Now, Gori's first machines were really just small 50cc off-roaders that included a motocross and enduro model, and in the early 1970s they also built a 6-speed 125 road racer that it said did very well in Italian road racing and hill climb events. And of course, naturally it wouldn't be too long before Moto Gori then got into the bigger motocross market, specialising in these smaller sized 125 twin shock race bikes. And this featured machine here is a prime example of one of these lightweight but very powerful 125 bikes that they produced in the mid 1970s. Now, the bike's chassis was a super light tubular steel type of construction that was both light and very strong, even for such a small 125, but it was well built and very well designed. Now, the bike's rear swing arm once again was a pretty straightforward steel construction, but it was also well engineered and strong enough to cope with anything that this little bike would come across, if it ever was put on a track, because as yet our featured bike here hasn't really seen any dirt since its recent rebuild. Now, Moto Gori never actually made their own engines for these 125s, and they used the German-built Sachs two-stroke power plants, which were already well proven because they'd been used in many different makes and models of motorcycles already, and they'd proven themselves to be very light, powerful and very reliable. So it's no surprise that Gori chose to put these hardy motors into their 125 tubular steel chassis. But you were certainly never short of cogs to shift on this 125 Sachs motor, because this little power plant here had 7 gears to choose from, so your left foot was kept very busy knocking up and down this little shifter. But as to why exactly you needed 7 gears on a small 125 motocrosser, I'm not exactly sure, but I suspect that it had something to do with Moto Gori using a similar motor on their 125 road racing bikes, so keeping the same Sachs motor in these Gori crossers would certainly save Sachs designing a brand new transmission. And so the fuel for our Sachs motor was fed through a quite substantial Bing carburetor into the Sachs piston port cylinder, and the air was also drawn through a foam air filter which was situated in the airbox here at the back of the carburetor. Now, once more, and as with many of the other off-road bikes of the 1970s, Moto Gori still used the exhaust expansion chamber routed underneath the engine, very similar to the old Honda Elsinores of that time, but these exhausts were prone to breakages and damage and needed constant repair, but it wouldn't be too long before manufacturers were then changing to the over the top of the engine type of configuration as the industry standard on future off-road bikes. And also a lot of these Italian motorcycle companies did tend to use locally sourced parts, and these front forks are almost certainly a pair of Marzoccis or maybe even Serianis, because both of these companies supplied suspension systems to all manner of motorcycle manufacturers in the 1960s and 70s, and even for that period these forks were still good enough to be fitted to these smaller bikes like 125s or even 250s. And as you can see, we still had old school drum brakes on both the front and at the back of our 125 Moto Gori, which again were quite surprisingly good stoppers for their day, although as I said, this wasn't really a heavy bike, so these drum brake systems were certainly more than adequate to slow down or even bring our Moto Gori to a quick standstill if it was required. So moving on to the back of the bike, these rear twin shock suspension units again are Italian made Marzocchi piggyback units with, of course, their combined gas and oil reservoirs there, which to be fair were high tech for the mid 1970s, but how they actually performed on the track I'm not really sure, although they certainly looked rugged enough. But as far as I'm aware, the gas tank on our Moto Gori is an alloy unit that naturally underwent a full refurbishment when Keith did all of the restoration work on the bike, and usually this fuel cell held enough two-stroke premix to keep that 125 Sachs motor buzzing along, but it's certainly nicely shaped and it looks like a perfect fit on that Moto Gori chassis. And once more, I'm pretty sure that both of these front and rear wheels, and of course their spokes, are all brand new items, because as I mentioned, this bike was just a collection of old spare parts, which more than likely never even included a pair of wheels in the first place. But these gold anodized rims certainly complement the Gori's red and silver tank and chassis, and it all comes together in a very fine looking motocross package. Although I have to say, there's certainly something about the styling of Italian motorcycles, and these smaller Moto Gori 125s are again quite typical of the kind of machines that the Italians were turning out in the early to mid 1970s. And in terms of the performance on the track, these Goris were certainly quick bikes, as you'd expect with that 7-speed gearbox, although how many times you'd actually be able to use that 7th gear on a bumpy track is maybe a bit debatable, but nevertheless, for a rare Italian race bike that started its life as just boxes of old Moto Gori motorcycle parts, you have to admit that the bike's builder, Keith Ree, has made a fantastic job of rescuing another very rare Italian stallion. Okay, so just to finish off this part 4 video in our series of looking at classic 125s, we're going to take a look at a machine that, to say the least, never received the greatest reviews when it first came out in 1992, and it was universally slated by the world's off-road publications of its day as possibly the worst off-road machine of that year. But as you can guess, the bike that we're referring to is the 1992 Type 519 CZ 125. Now, I'm pretty sure that you already know that the Czechoslovakian CZ company were renowned for building light, quick, two-stroke motocross race bikes, and in the 1960s and early 1970s they certainly built some of the fastest dirt bikes of that era, and some of the best scrambles racers of their day certainly cut their teeth on the old CZ twin port and side pipe racers of that time. But fast forward 30 years or so, and CZ were certainly finding it very difficult to compete with the much better Suzuki's, Kawasaki's and Hondas that were coming from Japan. And so in 1992 they then brought out this Type 519125, which initially looked like a decent bike, but that was of course until you put it on a racetrack. And basically this was the once great CZ Factory's attempt to stay in the highly competitive off-road market, which of course ended up being the end of the line for the once great CZ name. So beginning with the bike's frame, which was a tubular steel type of construction, and certainly wasn't the lightest of motocross chassis, and didn't have the quality engineering or even the welding that you found on the older CZ bikes of the past. But I suppose it could be described as functional at best. But of course it didn't help when the triple clamps were cast as one big steel unit, and even the mounting lugs for the bike's front number plate were also cast into that part. So as you can guess, this component alone was very heavy. But moving swiftly on to the 519's motor, which was a water-cooled two-stroke that had a case reed valve induction system and a modern style power valve as well. And to be fair, the casings for the engine were quite well made and the motor reasonably well designed, but it was still fitted with a big 36mm G-Koff carburetor that always had a reputation for bad running and flooding and leaks and other problems. But many of the 519s that were actually bought, the G-Koff carburetors were then thrown straight into the bin, and a better Mikuni was then fixed in its place. But even with the modern Mikuni carburetor, the power output of this motor was pretty dire, to put it mildly. But once more, the CZ125's rear swing arm was a heavy steel part that was formed as a top and bottom section that was then welded down the middle to give it its box shape. Now the rear CZ shock again was just a complete nightmare, and some riders even commented that it had so much rebound damping that when you compressed it, you could just then go and make yourself a cup of coffee while you were waiting for it to come back up. And at the bike's front end, the story wasn't really any better, because the CZ's forks were very poor in their operation, and you could also hear the internal springs rubbing away at the insides of the fork legs every time there was any movement on the bike up at the front. And although they may look like Italian Marzocchis, these were actually CZ copies of the Italian suspension systems. Now, as a standard fitting in 1992, these 519s came with a petrol tap on either side of the fuel tank, and it said that if you were a rider who liked to shift his weight onto the front of the bike, it was very easy just to hit this fuel cock with your knee and then turn the gas off, which naturally was never a good thing. Although on the plus side, our 125CZ in 1992 did certainly have a relatively modern hydraulic disc brake here on the rear, which was ample to slow the bike if you planned ahead. But I do remember a magazine dirt bike tester back in the day that said that he thought that this twin pot caliper looked like it'd been machined with a hacksaw. And to supply that rear brake with hydraulic fluid, it was just a simple piece of tubing with a rubber cap on the top that acted as a storage tank for the brake fluid. And it's not like the larger circular fluid storage devices that we have now on modern day motocrossers. Now, although you can't unfortunately see it in this picture, the 519 was also fitted with a 1950s style paper cartridge air filter, which was held just underneath this seat, which was a very bizarre part to fit to a relatively modern motocross bike. And although it actually worked, you couldn't afford to get it wet, because it would then of course just turn to mush, which isn't good, but not to mention the damage that it could do to the motor if bits and pieces were sucked inside. But when the CZ boffins got around to drawing up the plans for this brand new 1992 race bike, it looks like they must have had their blinkers on when they first put pen to paper, and really all they had to do was just take a look at a current Japanese bike just to give them their first starting point. Because all of the light alloy parts that were currently on a modern Japanese motocrosser, for some reason CZ just decided to make them out of much heavier steel, which you may have gotten away with maybe on a big bore open class race bike, but certainly not on a smaller 125 when weight is absolutely crucial to making these smaller bikes competitive. But I do remember when the great motocross bike tester Jody Weissel, who had a go on this model in the early 1990s, he commented that it wasn't really racing at all, because the bike was unbelievably slow and heavy, and it was really just a case of watching the pack pull away from you and then waiting for them to come back around on the next lap. But having said all that, our 519 CZ is still a rare beast, and this featured bike here hasn't really seen much action since it was new from 92, which is probably because of all of the aforementioned stats. But I certainly remember the day that I took these video clips and pictures, because we did actually try our damnedest to get this bike fired up, but after the first hour or so of kicking and swearing, we just basically gave up. But certainly our little 125 CZ is not a bike to buy if you want to be Johnny Holeshot or win 125 races, but nevertheless it's still a great bike to have if you're a collector, because on the face of it, it's quite a good looking machine, but then again, looks are never going to put you on the top step of that podium. Well, there you have it. I do hope you enjoyed taking a look at those three latest examples in our current 125 motocross bikes series. A couple of nice machines there, and maybe one not so nice bike there at the end with that 92 CZ 125. But coming up next here on CDB TV, we're going to take a look at this big 4-stroke thumper machine. Now, this is one of the latest bikes that's just been bought by John Porteous, and John told me that this was one of the very early HPF Hondas that were built. So we're going to be taking a look at John's big thumper in our next edition of CDB TV. But until the next time, everybody out there, continue to be safe and well. Watch what you're doing on those old vintage and classic dirt bikes, and we'll see you back here again very soon here on Classic Dirt Bike TV.